The scream tore through the castle before the sun had even risen. Guards dropped their spears and ran. Servants pressed themselves against the stone walls as King Varric Ashdown sprinted down the long hallway, his bare feet slapping against cold marble, his heart pounding harder than it ever had on any battlefield. He did not stop to grab a sword. He did not stop to call for his generals. He ran straight toward the sound of his son crying out in pain. He reached the nursery and shoved the heavy wooden door open so hard it cracked against the wall. Inside, chaos. A shattered window let in the freezing night wind. Blood stained the stone floor in a wide, dark pool, and curled in the corner, shaking, whimpering, was a small gray wolf cub no bigger than a loaf of bread. His fur was matted with blood. His tiny body trembled with each breath. Varric's whole world stopped. "Rowan," he whispered, dropping to his knees. "Rowan, look at me." The cub did not look at him. The cub did not move toward him at all. Instead, the small creature pressed himself tighter into the corner, as far from his father as the room would allow, and let out a sound that no parent should ever have to hear from their child, a sound of pure terror. Varric's hands hovered in the air, not knowing whether to reach out or pull back. Behind him, the castle physician rushed in, followed by 2 more healers, all gasping at the scene before them. "Where is she?" Varric asked, though some broken part of him already knew the answer. "Where is my wife?" No one answered. No one needed to. The blood on the floor told him everything. Queen Alara Ashdown, the woman who had ruled beside him for 11 years, the woman who had given him this one perfect son, was gone. She had died defending their child from an assassin who had climbed through that broken window in the dead of night, blade drawn, aiming for the small boy asleep in his bed. She had thrown herself in front of the blade meant for her son. And somewhere in the horror of that night, 5-year-old Prince Rowan, terrified beyond anything a child should ever feel, had shifted into his wolf form and had not shifted back since. That had been 4 months ago. Now, in the present, King Varric stood at the tall window of his private study, looking out over a kingdom that still did not know peace. Rain streaked down the glass in thin silver lines. Somewhere below, in a chamber built especially for him, his son curled in a nest of blankets, still a wolf, still silent, still refusing to let a single soul touch him. 4 months of healers coming and going. 4 months of the castle's best minds failing. 4 months of a father standing outside a door, watching his own child flinch at the sound of his footsteps. A knock sounded behind him. "Enter," Varric said, not turning around. His advisor, an older man named Callum Brightwater, stepped inside, holding a scroll against his chest like a shield. "Your Grace, the healer from the eastern village has arrived, the one recommended by the border towns." Varric turned slowly. His eyes, usually sharp and commanding, looked tired, in a way that no crown could hide. "Another healer. How many does that make now? 12? 13? 14, Your Grace. And they will fail like the others." Callum hesitated. "This one is different, sire. She does not work with medicine or magic. She works with animals, wounded ones, wild ones. The village elders say she calmed a mother bear that had lost her cubs to a hunter's trap. The bear let this woman remove the trap with her bare hands." Something flickered behind Varric's eyes. Not hope, not yet. He had buried hope so many times over these 4 months that he no longer trusted the feeling when it came. But something in Callum's words caught at him anyway. "Bring her in," Varric said. Minutes later, the study door opened again, and a young woman stepped inside. She was nothing like the healers who had come before her. She wore no fine robes, no jeweled amulets, no ceremonial markings. Her clothes were simple, plain brown fabric dusted with dried mud from the road, and her dark hair was pulled back in a loose braid that had clearly been done in haste that morning. She carried no bag of herbs, no staff, no scrolls of ancient spells. She simply stood there, quiet and steady, and looked at the king with clear, calm eyes that did not waver under his gaze. "Your name," Varric said. "Mira," she answered. Her voice was soft, but did not shake. "Mira Ashwood. You claim you can help wounded animals trust again." "I don't claim anything, Your Grace." Mira's chin lifted slightly. "I simply sit with them. I let them decide when they are ready. I do not force anything." Varric studied her for a long moment. Every healer before her had arrived with confidence, with promises, with grand words about curing his son within days. This woman offered nothing of the sort. If anything, her honesty unsettled him more than false confidence ever could. "My son is not an animal," Varric said, his voice sharpening. "He is a prince. He is a boy who watched his mother die protecting him, and now he cannot even remember how to be human again." Something softened in Mira's expression, though she did not flinch from the king's harsh tone. "Grief does not care about titles, your grace. A wounded heart is a wounded heart, whether it beats inside a prince or a bear cub. I cannot promise I will succeed where 14 others have failed, but I promise I will not force your son to do anything he is not ready to do, and I promise I will not give up on him after a single afternoon, the way some others might have." The words struck something deep in Varric's chest. He thought of the healers who had entered his son's chamber with bright smiles and left within an hour, shaking their heads, muttering about a case too severe, a trauma too deep, a child beyond their skill. "You may try," Varric said finally, "but understand this. My son has not let anyone near him in 4 months. Not healers, not his nursemaid, not even me, his own father. If you cannot succeed, I will not blame you, but I need you to understand what you are walking into." "I understand," Mira said simply. Callum led her from the study, down the winding stone stairs, through hallways lined with portraits of ancestors long gone, until they reached a heavy wooden door, guarded by 2 silent soldiers. Beyond that door was the chamber that had once been a sunroom, now converted into a space for a child who could not remember how to be a child. Mira paused before entering. "I will need you both to wait outside," she said, no offense meant. "But too many people in the room will only frighten him further." Callum looked uncertain, glancing toward the king for permission. Varric's jaw tightened, every instinct in him screaming to be near his son, to watch over him, to protect him the way he had failed to protect him that terrible night. But he forced himself to nod. "Very well," Varric said. "But if anything happens to him—" "Nothing will happen to him," Mira said gently. "I only wish to sit with him, that is all." The door opened, and she stepped inside alone. The chamber was dim, lit only by the gray light filtering through tall windows. In the far corner, buried beneath a pile of soft blankets, lay the small gray cub, so still that for a moment Mira wondered if he was even awake. But then she saw it, the faint rise and fall of his tiny chest, and 2 amber eyes watching her from the shadows, wide with fear. Mira did not move toward him. She did not speak his name, or reach out her hand. Instead, she lowered herself slowly to the floor, several feet away, and sat down cross-legged on the cold stone. She said nothing at all. Minutes passed. Then an hour. The cub watched her with unblinking eyes, his small body tense, ready to bolt if she came any closer. But she did not come closer. She simply sat, her hands resting quietly in her lap, her breathing slow and even. Outside the door, Varric paced. Callum stood beside him, arms crossed, watching the king wear a path into the stone floor with his restless steps. "She has been in there for over an hour," Varric muttered, "and I have heard nothing. No crying, no shifting, nothing." "Perhaps that is a good sign, your grace," Callum offered carefully. "Or perhaps she has already given up like the others, and simply does not know how to tell me." But inside the chamber, something was happening that neither man could see. The cub's rigid posture had begun, ever so slightly, to ease. His ears, which had been pinned flat against his skull since Mira entered, twitched once, then relaxed just a fraction. He did not come closer. He did not trust her yet. But for the first time in 4 months, in the presence of another living soul, the small prince did not tremble. When the sun began to dip low over the mountains outside, Mira finally rose to her feet, brushing the dust from her simple dress. She had not touched the boy. She had not spoken more than a handful of soft words the entire visit. But as she turned to leave, she glanced back one final time. The cub was watching her still, but the fear in his eyes had shifted into something else, something closer to curiosity. "I will come back tomorrow," Mira said quietly, "to no one and everyone. There is no need to be afraid of me. I am not going anywhere." She stepped out into the hallway, where Varric turned to face her immediately, searching her expression for any sign of failure or success. "Well?" he demanded. "He is still afraid," Mira admitted. But he is not as afraid as he was this morning. That is all? After an entire afternoon, that is all you have to tell me? Mira met his gaze without flinching, the same calm steadiness in her eyes that had first caught his attention in the study. Healing does not happen in a single afternoon, Your Grace. It did not break in a single night either, even though it may feel that way to you. Give me time. I am not asking you to trust me completely. I am only asking you not to send me away before I have truly begun. Varric stared at her for a long moment, torn between the exhaustion of 4 months of failure and the strange, quiet certainty in this woman's voice. Every part of his kingly instincts told him to demand results, to threaten consequences, to push harder, the way he pushed his generals and his council. But something about the way she spoke of his son, not as a broken prince to be fixed, but as a frightened child who simply needed patience, made him hold his tongue. You may continue, he said finally, but I will be watching. I would expect nothing less from a father, Mira said. And for the briefest moment, something almost like a smile touched the corner of her mouth, before she turned and walked away, down the long stone hallway, leaving the king standing alone outside his son's door, wondering, for the first time in 4 months, if perhaps there was still a reason to hope. Behind that door, curled in his nest of blankets, the small cub watched the space where the quiet woman had been sitting only moments before, and for reasons he could not explain even to himself, some small, buried part of him already wanted her to come back. Morning came slow and gray over the castle, the kind of light that made the stone walls look colder than usual. Mira arrived before the sun had fully risen, walking the same path she had walked the day before, past the guards who no longer questioned her, past the servants who whispered to each other as she passed. She had not slept well. All night her mind had returned to the small cub curled in the corner of that chamber, to the way his amber eyes had followed her every movement, without ever once trusting her enough to close. She knew fear like that. She had seen it in wounded animals her entire life, in creatures who had learned that the world was not safe, that even kindness could hide a blade. But she had never seen it in a child before, not like this. When she stepped into the chamber that morning, the cub was already awake, watching the door as if he had been waiting. His small body was still tense, still pressed into the corner among his blankets, but something in his posture had changed overnight. He did not press himself quite as far back as he had the day before. Mira lowered herself to the floor in the same spot as yesterday, cross-legged, hands resting quietly in her lap. She did not speak right away. Instead, she reached into the small cloth bag she had brought with her, and withdrew a piece of dried meat, setting it gently on the stone floor between them, then sliding it forward with 2 fingers, before pulling her hand back to a respectful distance. The cub's nose twitched. His eyes flicked from the meat to Mira, then back again, calculating, uncertain. You do not have to take it, Mira said softly. I only wanted you to know it was there, in case you were hungry. Minutes passed in silence. The cub did not move. Mira did not push. She began to hum instead, a low, wordless tune that she had learned from her grandmother years ago, the same tune she used to calm frightened creatures brought to her doorstep. Birds with broken wings, foxes caught in hunters' snares, and once, a wolf pup abandoned by its pack after a harsh winter had claimed its mother. The humming filled the quiet chamber, soft and steady, neither rising nor falling too sharply, the kind of sound that asked nothing and demanded nothing. Slowly, so slowly that Mira almost missed it, the cub's ears turned toward her. Outside the door, Varric stood in the hallway once again, his arms crossed over his chest, his jaw tight with the effort of staying where he was, instead of pushing the door open and demanding to know what was happening inside. Callum stood beside him, patient as always, though even his calm expression had begun to show signs of strain. She has been in there for 2 hours now, Varric said quietly. What could she possibly be doing for 2 hours? Perhaps, Your Grace, healing simply takes longer than we wish it to, Callum offered. Varric said nothing, but his gaze remained fixed on the closed door, as if he could somehow see through solid wood, by sheer force of will. Inside, the humming had stopped. Mira sat in silence again, watching the cub with patient eyes. And then, so slowly that it seemed to take an eternity, the small creature shifted his weight forward, just an inch, then another, until his nose was close enough to sniff the piece of dried meat resting on the stone floor. Mira held perfectly still, She did not smile. She did not speak. She barely allowed herself to breathe, afraid that even the smallest movement might send the frightened cub retreating back into his corner. The cub sniffed the meat once, twice, and then, with a speed that startled even Mira, snatched it up and darted backward, chewing quickly as though someone might try to take it from him. It was such a small thing, a single piece of food, taken and eaten, but to Mira, it felt like the first crack in a wall that had stood unbroken for 4 months. She did not push her luck. She rose to her feet slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements, and gave the smallest of nods toward the cub, who watched her with wary but slightly less terrified eyes. "That is enough for today," she said softly. "I will see you tomorrow." When she stepped out into the hallway, Varric turned to her immediately, the same demanding look in his eyes as the day before. "What happened in there?" "He ate," Mira said simply. Varric blinked. "He ate? That is all? Your Grace, may I ask you something?" Varric's brow furrowed at the shift in her tone, but he nodded once. "When was the last time your son ate something offered by a human hand, rather than left on a tray and retrieved only once everyone had gone?" The question landed heavier than Varric expected. He opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again, searching his memory. The servants left food for Rowan 3 times a day, and it was always gone by the time they returned to collect the tray. But no one had actually seen him eat it. No one had watched him take food directly from another living hand. "Not in 4 months. I do not know," Varric admitted quietly. And the admission cost him something, a small piece of the composure he wore like armor in front of his court. "That is what happened today," Mira said. "It may not seem like much to you. But trust is built in moments this small, Your Grace. A wounded creature does not learn to trust a hand all at once. It learns one small kindness at a time, until one day the kindnesses outweigh the fear." Varric studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his tired eyes. "You speak of him as though you understand him." "I understand fear," Mira said. "I have spent my whole life around creatures who carry more of it than they can hold. Your son is no different, except that his fear wears the shape of a small boy who lost everything in a single night." The words struck deep, and for a moment, Varric's carefully controlled expression cracked, just slightly, just enough for Mira to see the raw grief hiding beneath the crown, and the title, and the weight of ruling a kingdom that had no patience for a father's broken heart. "You may return tomorrow," Varric said, his voice rougher than before. "I intend to," Mira replied. As she walked away down the long stone corridor, Callum turned to the king with a curious expression. "You seem different around her, Your Grace, if I may say so." "She is the first person in 4 months who has not promised me a miracle," Varric said, watching Mira's retreating figure until she disappeared around the corner. "Perhaps that is exactly why I believe she might actually deliver one." That evening, after the castle had grown quiet and most of its occupants had retired for the night, Varric found himself standing outside his son's chamber once again, unable to sleep, unable to stay away. He did not go inside. He knew better than that by now. But he stood there in the darkness, listening to the silence beyond the door, wondering what his son's dreams looked like now, wondering if there was any part of the boy who remembered his father's voice, his father's laugh, the nights before the world had broken apart. He thought of Alara then, as he did every night, her memory rising unbidden in the quiet hours, when there was no one left to witness a king's grief. She would have known what to do. She had always known what to do, had always been the warmth in their family that balanced his sternness, the laughter that softened his rule. "I am trying," he whispered to the empty hallway, to the memory of a woman who could no longer hear him. "I do not know if it is enough, but I am trying." Behind the door, curled in his blankets, the small cub lifted his head at the faint sound of his father's voice, muffled through the thick wood. He did not move toward the door. He was not ready for that, not yet. But for the first time in 4 months, he did not press himself deeper into the corner at the sound either. He simply listened, amber eyes catching the moonlight, until the voice fell silent, and the castle settled once more into an uneasy, waiting quiet. By the end of the first week, the entire castle had begun to whisper about the quiet woman who spent her mornings sitting silently in the young prince's chamber. Some servants said she was a witch who spoke the language of beasts. Others claimed she was simply lucky, and that the boy would have come around eventually no matter who sat with him. Mira paid no attention to any of it. She arrived each morning at the same hour, sat in the same spot, and let the small cub set the pace of everything that happened between them. Progress came in pieces so small that anyone watching without patience might have missed them entirely. On the third day, the cub allowed her to sit only a few feet closer than before. On the fourth day, he no longer flinched when she hummed her quiet, wordless tune. On the fifth day, he approached the piece of food she offered without waiting for her to step back first. But it was on the seventh day that something truly shifted. Mira arrived that morning to find the chamber unusually quiet, too quiet. The cub was not curled in his usual corner among the blankets. For one terrible moment, panic gripped her chest, fear that something had happened, that the guards outside had failed in their watch. Then she spotted him, pressed against the far wall near the tall windows, his small body shaking. Not from fear of her, she realized, but from something else entirely. A storm was rolling in over the mountains. Dark clouds had gathered thick and heavy in the sky, and even as she watched, the first low rumble of thunder rolled across the horizon. The cub's ears flattened at the sound. He let out a small, involuntary whimper and pressed himself even further into the corner, his tail curling tight around his trembling body. Mira moved slowly, cautiously, closer than she had ever dared to go before. She did not rush toward him. She simply closed the distance one careful step at a time, watching his reaction with every movement, ready to stop the instant he showed any sign of true fear toward her, rather than the storm. Another crack of thunder split the sky, louder this time, and the cub let out a sharp, frightened cry. Something in Mira's chest ached at the sound. She had heard that particular cry before, in wounded animals who had lost everything they trusted in a single violent moment. It was the sound of a creature who no longer believed the world was safe, even in its own home. "It is only thunder," she said softly, lowering herself to sit just a few feet away from him now, closer than she had ever been. "It cannot hurt you. I promise you that." The cub did not seem to hear her, or perhaps he heard her but could not believe her, not with the storm rattling the windows and the memory of another terrible night still buried somewhere deep in his small body. He shook harder, curling into as tight a ball as his form allowed. Mira made a decision then, one she had not planned, one that went against every careful, patient step she had taken over the past week. She reached out, slowly, giving him every opportunity to pull away, and let her fingers rest gently against the blanket beside him, not touching him directly, simply closing the distance a little further. The cub's eyes snapped toward her hand, wide with alarm. For a moment, Mira feared she had moved too fast, undone a week of careful progress in a single reckless second. But then the thunder cracked again, closer this time, and instead of retreating from her hand, the small cub did something neither of them expected. He pressed himself against it. Not toward Mira exactly, not seeking her comfort directly, but seeking the warmth and solidity of something steady, in a world that felt as though it might shatter apart with each roll of thunder. His small body trembled against her palm, and slowly, carefully, Mira turned her hand until she was cradling him gently, offering warmth rather than demanding trust. The cub did not pull away. Tears gathered unexpectedly in Mira's eyes as she held the small, shaking creature, humming her quiet tune once more, softer now, steadier, a sound meant to anchor him through the storm raging outside the window. He was not choosing her, not truly, not yet. He was simply too frightened and too exhausted to fight the comfort she offered. But it was contact. After 4 months of nothing, it was contact. She did not know how long they stayed like that, the storm rolling overhead, the cub trembling against her palm, slowly beginning to calm as the thunder grew more distant. She did not notice the door creak open behind her. Varric stood frozen in the doorway, having come to check on his son the moment the storm began, knowing how loud thunder could be within these old stone walls. He had expected to find his son alone and terrified, as he always was during storms, curled into himself with no one able to offer him comfort. Instead, he found Mira sitting on the floor, cradling his son's small trembling body against her hand, humming a soft tune, while the boy who had refused every touch for 4 months pressed himself closer to her warmth, rather than pulling away. Something broke open in Varric's chest at the sight, a mixture of overwhelming relief, and a grief so sharp it nearly stole the breath from his lungs. Relief, because his son was finally allowing comfort from another living soul. Grief, because it was not him his son had chosen. It was a stranger who had been in their lives for only a week, rather than the father who had failed to protect him on the worst night of both their lives. He did not enter the room. He did not want to disturb the fragile moment unfolding before him. He simply stood in the doorway, watching, his hand pressed silently against the stone frame, as though he needed something solid to hold on to as well. Mira glanced up and caught his eye, and something passed between them in that silent exchange, an understanding neither needed to speak aloud. She did not smile triumphantly. She did not gesture for him to come closer. She simply held his gaze for a moment, then returned her attention to the small cub in her arms, giving Varric the space to feel whatever he needed to feel without an audience. He stepped back from the doorway and closed the door as softly as he could manage, then stood alone in the hallway, his back pressed against the cold stone wall, and allowed himself, for the first time in 4 months, to weep. It was not weakness. He knew that, even as the tears came. It was the release of 4 months of carrying grief alone, of standing outside a door he could not enter, of failing, again and again, to reach the one person left in the world who mattered more to him than his crown, his kingdom, or his own life. His son had finally let someone in. It was not him, not yet, but it was a beginning, and after 4 months of believing there would be no beginning at all, Varric found he could accept that small, painful truth, and still feel something close to hope. Inside the chamber, the storm continued to roll overhead, but its violence had eased, the thunder growing softer and more distant with each passing minute. The cub remained curled against Mira's palm, his trembling finally beginning to still, his breathing slowing into something calmer, something almost peaceful. "You are safe," Mira whispered to him, so quietly that the words were meant for him alone. "I know it does not feel that way. I know the world took something from you that it should never have taken. But you are safe now, little one. I promise you that." The cub's amber eyes drifted closed, exhaustion finally overtaking fear, and for the first time in 4 months, Prince Rowan fell asleep touching another living being, rather than curled alone in a corner, guarding himself against a world that had already hurt him more than any child should ever have to bear. Mira stayed with him until the storm passed completely, until the gray afternoon light returned to the windows, until she was certain he was deeply, peacefully asleep. Only then did she carefully withdraw her hand, tucking the blankets gently around his small sleeping form, before rising quietly to her feet. When she stepped out into the hallway, she found Varric still there, his eyes red-rimmed, but his composure restored, standing tall once more, as though the moment of weeping had never happened. Mira said nothing about it. She understood, better than most, that some things needed to be witnessed in private and then folded away, kept safe, until a person was ready to carry them differently. "He is asleep," she said simply. "The storm frightened him badly, but he let me help him through it." "I saw," Varric said quietly, his voice rougher than usual. "Thank you." "You do not need to thank me, Your Grace." "I do," Varric said, and something in his tone made Mira look at him more closely. "You have given him something none of us could give him, comfort. I do not know how to thank someone for that." Mira held his gaze for a long moment, seeing past the crown and the title to the exhausted, grieving father beneath. "He will let you in too," she said softly. "It will take time, but I have seen this before, in animals who trusted no one after being badly hurt. The trust returns slowly, but it does return, and when it does, it is often strongest with those who never stopped waiting for it." Varric did not answer right away. He simply nodded, once, and turned to look at the closed door behind them, imagining his son sleeping peacefully within, something he had not been able to picture in 4 long months. "Tomorrow," he said finally. "Will you come again tomorrow?" "I will come every day," Mira said, "until he no longer needs me to." She turned and walked down the corridor, leaving Varric standing alone once more. But for the first time since that terrible night, the silence around him did not feel quite so heavy. Weeks passed, and the castle began to feel the shift in its air, though no one could quite name why. The servants noticed that the king ordered fewer meals sent to his study late at night, choosing instead to eat in the family hall, even if he still ate alone. The guards noticed that his temper, once quick to flare during council meetings, had grown steadier, quieter, though his eyes still carried the same weight they had carried since the night the queen died. Mira noticed something else entirely. She noticed that Varric had begun arriving earlier each morning, standing just outside the chamber door, before she even arrived, as though he could not bring himself to stay away any longer, even if he was not yet permitted inside. One morning, she found him seated on a low bench in the hallway, his elbows resting on his knees, his head bowed low. He looked up when he heard her footsteps, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "You are here early, Your Grace," Mira said. "I could not sleep," Varric admitted. It was the first time he had confessed something so personal to her, and the words seemed to surprise even himself. Mira lowered herself onto the bench beside him, keeping a respectful distance, but close enough that he did not feel alone in the confession. "Grief rarely allows for peaceful sleep," she said. "I have seen it take many shapes in many people. Some cannot eat, some cannot stop working, some simply lie awake, staring at nothing, waiting for morning to arrive so they have something to do besides think." "You speak as though you understand this well," Varric said, studying her face for the first time with genuine curiosity, rather than the guarded skepticism of their first meeting. Mira was quiet for a moment before answering. "My mother died when I was young. Not suddenly, the way your queen passed. Slowly, over the course of a hard winter, when there was no medicine left in our village, and no coin to buy more from the next town. I watched her fade a little more each day, and there was nothing I could do but sit beside her and hold her hand until the end came." "I am sorry," Varric said quietly. "It was a long time ago," Mira said, though the flicker of old pain in her eyes suggested the wound had never fully closed, only scarred over, in the way old wounds sometimes did. "After she passed, my father could not bear to look at me. I looked too much like her," he said. He was not cruel about it, not exactly. He simply could not be near me without seeing everything he had lost. So I learned to spend my days elsewhere, in the forest, with the animals no one else wanted to care for. The wounded ones. The ones everyone else had given up on. Varric listened in silence, something shifting in his understanding of the woman beside him. He had assumed, without ever truly examining the assumption, that her gift with wounded creatures was simply a skill she had learned, a trade passed down or taught by some mentor. He had not considered that it might have been born from her own grief, her own loneliness, her own experience of being someone that even those who loved her could not bring themselves to face. "Is that why you understand him so well?" Varric asked, nodding toward the closed door of his son's chamber. "Because you know what it feels like to be looked at and reminded of something painful, rather than being seen for who you actually are." Mira's eyes widened slightly at the perceptiveness of the question, and for a moment, something like surprise crossed her features. "Perhaps," she admitted. "I had not thought of it in quite those words before, but perhaps that is exactly it." They sat together in silence for a while after that, the early morning light growing brighter through the tall hallway windows, neither feeling the need to fill the quiet with more words. It was a strange sort of comfort, Varric realized, sitting beside someone who did not ask him to be strong, who did not require him to perform the role of unshaken king, who simply allowed him to exist as a tired, grieving father, for a few quiet minutes before the day demanded otherwise of him. "I failed him," Varric said suddenly, the words escaping before he had fully decided to speak them. "That night, I was in the West Wing, dealing with matters of the border, matters that seemed so important at the time, and now feel like nothing at all. By the time I heard the commotion, by the time I reached the nursery, it was already over. She was already gone. And Rowan was already—" He gestured vaguely toward the door, unable to finish the sentence. "You did not fail him," Mira said firmly, turning to face him directly. "You were not the one who broke that window. You were not the one who raised that blade. The fault belongs entirely to the person who committed that terrible act, and to no one else in this castle. I was his father. I was meant to protect them both." "You are still his father," Mira said. "And from what I have seen these past weeks, you have not stopped trying to protect him, even now. Even when protecting him means standing outside a door and waiting, which I imagine is one of the hardest things a father could be asked to do." Varric said nothing, but something in his chest loosened slightly at her words, some small portion of the guilt he had carried alone for 4 months finding. for the first time, somewhere else to rest, even if only briefly. He will need you when he is ready, Mira continued. Not a version of you scrubbed clean of grief or fear, pretending everything is fine. He will need the father who understands exactly what was taken from both of you that night, because you are the only other person in this world who lost precisely what he lost. What if he is never ready? Varric asked, voicing the fear that had haunted him every night since the attack. What if he stays like this forever, trapped in that small form, unable to remember how to be anything else? He will not stay like this forever, Mira said, with a certainty that Varric desperately wanted to believe. I have seen creatures far more broken than your son find their way back to themselves, given enough patience and enough safety. It will not happen overnight. It may not even happen quickly. But it will happen, Your Grace. I believe that with everything I know about wounded things and how they heal. Varric studied her face for a long moment, searching for any sign of false comfort, any hint that she was simply telling him what he wanted to hear. He found none. Only steady, quiet conviction. The same conviction that had carried her through every patient hour spent sitting on the floor of his son's chamber, asking nothing, offering everything. Thank you, he said finally, for not lying to me the way the others did. I would never lie to you about your son, Mira said. He deserves better than false promises, and so do you. The door beside them creaked open just then, and both of them turned to see one of the castle's junior healers stepping out, her expression carefully neutral, in the way of someone delivering news she was not certain how to categorize. Your Grace, she said, addressing Varric with a small bow. The prince is awake. He has been watching the door for the past several minutes, as though he is waiting for something. Mira rose to her feet immediately, but paused before entering, glancing back at Varric with an unspoken question in her eyes. Go, Varric said. I will wait here, as I always do. But as Mira disappeared through the doorway, something new stirred in Varric's chest, a small, fragile thought he had not allowed himself to consider before. Perhaps waiting outside the door was not the only role left to him as a father. Perhaps, with enough patience, enough time, and perhaps with Mira's steady guidance, there might come a day when the waiting ended, and he would finally be allowed to step inside and hold his son the way he had ached to since the moment the world had broken apart around them both. He settled back onto the bench, folded his hands together, and waited, as he had every day for the past several weeks. But for the first time, the waiting felt less like punishment and more like patience, the quiet, deliberate kind that might, given enough time, finally be rewarded. The days that followed brought changes so gradual that only someone watching as closely as Mira could have charted them properly. The cub no longer retreated to the farthest corner of the chamber when she entered each morning. Instead, he waited near the center of the room, sometimes even trotting a few steps toward her, before catching himself and stopping, as though some old instinct still warned him against wanting anything too openly. Mira had begun bringing small toys along with her food offerings, simple things carved from soft wood, a ball that rolled unevenly across the stone floor, a length of rope tied into loose knots. She did not push him to play. She simply set the items down and let him discover them in his own time, the same way she had let him discover the safety of her presence. It was on a quiet afternoon, nearly 6 weeks after her first visit, that the cub finally rolled the wooden ball toward her instead of away. Mira stilled completely, hardly daring to breathe, watching the small wooden sphere wobble its way across the uneven stone floor until it bumped gently against her knee. She looked up at the cub, who stood watching her with wide, uncertain eyes, his tail giving one small, hesitant wag, before he seemed to catch himself, unsure if such a thing was allowed. You want to play, Mira said softly, and something in her voice must have reassured him, because the tail wagged again, slightly more confident this time. She rolled the ball back toward him, gently, careful not to send it too fast or too close. The cub pounced on it immediately, batting it between his front paws with a clumsy enthusiasm that struck Mira as almost painfully ordinary, the kind of behavior any young pup might display, if that pup had not spent the last month and a half locked in a prison built from grief and fear. For the first time since she had begun visiting, Mira heard something she had never expected to hear from this particular chamber. A small, surprised bark of pure delight. She laughed softly at the sound, unable to help herself, and rolled the ball again, watching the cub chase it with growing enthusiasm, his earlier caution melting away piece by piece as the simple joy of play took hold of him. Outside the door, as had become his habit, Varric stood listening, and when the sound of his son's joyful bark reached his ears, something in his chest nearly buckled beneath the weight of it. He had not heard a sound of pure happiness from behind that door in 6 weeks. He had begun to wonder, in his darkest private moments, if he ever would again. He did not enter. He still respected the careful boundaries Mira had established, understanding now, more than he ever had before, the wisdom behind her patience. But he allowed himself, for just a moment, to press his forehead against the cool wood of the door, and simply listen to his son playing, the sound more precious to him than any treasure his kingdom possessed. When Mira emerged some time later, she found him still standing there, his eyes bright with unshed tears. He made no attempt to hide this time. "He played," Varric said, his voice thick with emotion. "I heard him. He actually played." "He did," Mira confirmed, a warm smile spreading across her own face, the first real smile Varric had seen from her since her arrival. "It was a wonderful thing to witness, Your Grace." "Will you tell me something honestly?" Varric asked, searching her face. "Do you believe he will ever shift back? Do you believe my son will ever be a boy again, rather than trapped forever in that small form?" Mira considered the question carefully before answering, understanding the weight it carried, unwilling to offer empty comfort on something so important. "I believe the shift is tied to fear more than anything else," she said finally. "When a young wolf shifts under extreme distress, sometimes the mind builds walls around the change, walls meant to protect, even if those walls end up becoming their own kind of prison. I believe that as his fear eases, as he feels safer, those walls will begin to weaken. I cannot promise you a day or a month when it will happen, but I believe it will happen, when he is ready, and not a moment before. And what happens if he is never ready? Then he will grow up as a wolf who happens to also be a prince," Mira said simply. "And he will still be loved, still be capable of joy, still be your son, in every way that matters. But I do not believe that will be his fate, Your Grace. Not from what I have witnessed these past weeks. He is fighting his way back to himself, one small step at a time. I have simply been fortunate enough to walk alongside him while he does it." Varric nodded slowly, absorbing her words, feeling the strange mixture of hope and fear that seemed to define nearly every moment of his life these days. "You have given him something I could not," he said. "I want you to know that I see it, and I am grateful for it, beyond what words can properly express." "You have given him something too, Your Grace," Mira said gently. "Perhaps you do not see it as clearly as I do, standing on the outside of this, but every single day, you have been here. You have waited outside that door without fail, no matter how difficult the waiting has been. He may not know it consciously yet, not in the way a wolf understands scent and sound and presence, but some part of him knows his father has never once left him alone in this. That matters more than you realize." They stood together in the quiet hallway for a long moment, something unspoken settling comfortably between them, a kind of understanding that had grown slowly over the past several weeks, built not from grand gestures but from small, patient moments, exactly like this one. "I should return to my duties," Varric said eventually, though something in his tone suggested reluctance to leave the conversation behind. "The council meets within the hour, and I fear they will grow restless without me there to remind them who holds the crown." "Of course, Your Grace." He turned to leave, then paused, glancing back at her with an expression she had not seen from him before, something almost hesitant beneath the usual composed authority he carried. "Mira," he said, using her name directly for perhaps the first time. "Would you consider joining me for the evening meal tonight? Not as a healer reporting on my son's progress, simply as a guest, sharing a table, after a long day." The question caught Mira slightly off guard, and for a moment, she was uncertain how to answer. She had come to this castle for one purpose only, to help a wounded child find his way back to himself, and she had not considered, until this exact moment, that something else might be growing alongside that purpose, something she had not anticipated and was not entirely certain how to name. "I would like that," she said finally, and found, somewhat to her surprise, that she meant it completely. Varric's expression softened into something that might have been the beginning of a genuine smile, an expression his court had not seen from their king in a very long time. "Tonight, then," he said, before turning and walking down the corridor, his steps lighter than they had been in months. Mira watched him go, then glanced back at the closed door behind her, thinking of the small cub inside, still playing with his wooden ball, still slowly rediscovering pieces of the joy that had been stolen from him on that terrible night. She had come to this castle believing she understood exactly what kind of healing she had been called to provide. Standing there in the quiet hallway, watching the king disappear around the corner, she began to wonder if perhaps there was more than one kind of wound in this castle, waiting to be gently, patiently mended. The dinner that evening marked a quiet turning point, though neither Varric nor Mira spoke of it in such grand terms at the time. They spoke instead of small things, ordinary things, the kind of conversation that had nothing to do with grief or healing or the weight of a kingdom. Varric asked about her village, about the animals she had cared for over the years, about the grandmother who had taught her the wordless tune she hummed to calm frightened creatures. Mira asked about his childhood, about the man he had been before the crown had settled onto his shoulders, about the small, unguarded laugh that escaped him once, briefly, when she described the mother bear who had nearly taken her hand off, before finally allowing her near. It became, in the weeks that followed, something of a quiet habit between them. Most evenings, after Mira's visits with Rowan concluded and Varric's council duties finished for the day, they would share a simple meal together in a smaller dining hall, away from the formal eyes of the court. Neither called it courtship, neither dared to name it anything at all, uncertain of what such a name might mean, given everything else happening around them. But the castle staff noticed the way the king's shoulders seemed to carry less weight after these evenings, and the way Mira's tired eyes brightened whenever his voice sounded in the hallway. 2 months after her arrival, on a night when storm clouds gathered thick and heavy over the mountains once more, everything changed. Mira woke suddenly in her small guest chamber, roused by a sound she could not immediately place. She lay still for a moment, listening, until she realized the sound was coming from somewhere down the hallway. A distant, muffled cry, carried faintly through the old stone walls. She was out of bed and moving before she had fully decided to move, pulling a shawl around her shoulders as she hurried barefoot through the darkened corridors toward the sound. It grew louder as she approached the young prince's chamber, and her heart clenched at the sound. It was not the whimper of ordinary fear she had grown used to hearing during storms. This was something sharper, more desperate, the unmistakable sound of a nightmare too vivid to escape. She reached the door just as one of the night guards moved to open it, his expression torn between duty and uncertainty. "He has been like this for several minutes," the guard said. "We did not want to disturb him without knowing what to do." "Let me in," Mira said, and the guard stepped aside immediately, having learned over the past 2 months to trust her instincts where the young prince was concerned. Inside, the chamber was dark, except for the faint moonlight spilling through the tall windows, illuminating the small cub thrashing among his blankets, caught in the grip of a nightmare that clearly refused to release him. His small body twisted and jerked, and the sounds coming from him were unlike anything Mira had heard before. Sharp, panicked cries that spoke of terror too deep for words, even wolf words, to properly express. She understood immediately what nightmare gripped him. It could only be one thing. The broken window, the blade, his mother's final, desperate act to save him. "Rowan," she said softly, moving carefully toward him, though every instinct told her this moment called for something beyond her usual patient distance. "Rowan, you are safe. It is only a dream. You are safe." The cub did not wake at her voice. He continued to thrash, caught fully in the grip of whatever horror his sleeping mind had constructed from that terrible night, reliving something no child, wolf or human, should ever have to relive, even once, let alone over and over in the depths of sleep. Mira knelt beside him, uncertain for the first time in 2 months exactly what the right course of action might be. She had always let him choose the pace, always waited for him to close the distance, rather than closing it herself. But a nightmare of this severity felt different, felt like a moment that called for something beyond patient waiting. She reached out, and gently, carefully, gathered the trembling cub into her arms. For one terrifying second, she feared she had made a mistake, feared he might wake and panic further at finding himself held so completely, undoing every careful step of progress they had built together. But instead, something remarkable happened. The cub, still deep in the grip of his nightmare, pressed himself instinctively closer to her warmth, seeking comfort even in his sleep, his small body curling tightly against her chest, as though some part of him, some deep and ancient part that existed beneath conscious thought, recognized safety when it found it. Mira held him close, rocking gently, humming her quiet tune, whispering soft reassurances against his fur. "You are safe now," she murmured. "It was only a dream, only a memory, trying to hurt you again. But it cannot hurt you here. Not with me. Not ever again." Slowly, gradually, the cub's thrashing eased. His desperate cries softened into quiet whimpers, then into nothing at all beyond the steady rhythm of his breathing, finally slowing as the nightmare released its grip. But he did not pull away from her once he settled. Instead, still mostly asleep, still caught somewhere between dream and waking, he burrowed deeper into her lap, small paws pressing against her chest, seeking a closeness he had denied himself and everyone else for 2 long months. The door creaked open, and Varric stepped inside, having been woken by a guard who knew better than to keep such news from the king. He froze in the doorway at the sight before him. Mira sat on the floor amid the scattered blankets, cradling his son fully in her lap, the small cub curled trustingly against her, sleeping peacefully now, his earlier terror completely dissolved into the safety of her embrace. Varric's breath caught in his throat. He had witnessed small moments of progress over these past 2 months, the storm, the shared food, the wooden ball rolled across the floor in tentative play. But this was different. This was his son, fully surrendering his guard, allowing himself to be held completely, something he had refused every single person, including his own father, since the night everything had shattered. Mira looked up and met his gaze, her own eyes bright with emotion she made no attempt to hide. "He came to me," she whispered, her voice thick. "In his sleep, in the middle of his worst fear, some part of him chose safety. He chose to be held." Varric crossed the room slowly, lowering himself to the floor beside them, careful not to disturb the fragile, precious peace that had settled over his sleeping son. He reached out with a trembling hand and gently touched the cub's fur, the first time he had touched his son in 2 full months. Rowan stirred slightly at the contact but did not wake, and did not pull away. Tears slipped freely down Varric's face now, and he made no effort to stop them, no effort to maintain the composed mask of kingship in this quiet, sacred moment. "He is not afraid of me," he whispered, wonder threading through his broken voice. "He is not pulling away. He is exhausted from his nightmare," Mira said gently. "But know, Your Grace, he is not pulling away. I believe, given time, he will let you hold him just as he has let me. Tonight was the beginning of that. I am certain of it." Varric remained beside them for a long while, watching his son sleep peacefully in Mira's arms, occasionally reaching out to stroke the soft fur along his back, marveling each time that the small creature did not flinch away from his touch. "Thank you," he said eventually, his voice barely above a whisper, "for everything you have done, for everything you continue to do. I do not know how I will ever repay this debt." "There is no debt between us, Your Grace," Mira said softly. "I did not come here seeking payment. I came here because a child was suffering, and I could not bear to walk away from that, no matter what title he carried." "Even so," Varric said, his eyes meeting hers in the dim moonlight, something warm and unguarded passing between them that had nothing to do with his son at all. "You have given both of us something precious these past 2 months. I hope you know that." Mira held his gaze, feeling the weight and warmth of the moment settle around them, the sleeping child between them, the storm finally quieting outside the windows, the castle holding its breath around this small, fragile, beautiful turning point. "I know," she said softly. "I feel it too." They remained there together until the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the windows, neither willing to disturb the peace that had finally, after so much waiting, found its way into that quiet chamber. The morning after the nightmare marked the beginning of a new chapter in the young prince's healing, one that moved with a speed that surprised even Mira, who had spent years learning the patient rhythms of wounded creatures. It was as though some invisible dam had finally broken, releasing all the trust that had been quietly building beneath the surface for 2 long months. Rowan allowed his father to sit beside him the very next day, something that would have seemed impossible only a week earlier. He remained cautious at first, watching Varric with wary eyes whenever the king entered the chamber, but he no longer retreated to the far corner. He no longer trembled at the sound of his father's footsteps in the hallway. Slowly, over the following days, he began to close the distance between them on his own terms, first sitting a few feet away, then close enough to be touched, then finally, on a quiet afternoon, nearly a week after the nightmare, climbing directly into his father's lap, the way he had once climbed into Mira's. Varric held his son that day with a reverence that brought fresh tears to his eyes, careful and gentle, as though the small creature in his arms might shatter if held too tightly, though in truth, it was Varric's own heart that felt most fragile in that moment. "I have missed you," he whispered against the soft fur of his son's head. "I have missed you more than I know how to say." The cub did not answer, could not answer in the way his father needed, but he pressed closer, and that closeness spoke more clearly than words ever could have. Mira watched these moments unfold with quiet satisfaction, though she never allowed herself to become complacent about the progress. Healing, she knew from long experience, rarely moved in a straight line. There would be setbacks. There would be days when old fears resurfaced without warning, when a loud noise, or an unexpected shadow, sent Rowan retreating back into old patterns of withdrawal. She prepared Varric for this possibility carefully, wanting him to understand that true healing required patience through the difficult days, as much as celebration during the good ones. The true test of that healing came nearly 3 weeks later, on an ordinary afternoon that began like any other. Mira had arrived at her usual hour, finding Rowan already awake and alert, his tail wagging in greeting the moment she entered the chamber, a gesture that would have seemed miraculous only 2 months earlier and now felt almost ordinary, almost expected. She settled onto the floor as always, and they spent a pleasant hour together, playing with the wooden ball, sharing quiet moments of comfortable silence. It was during this quiet hour that something extraordinary began to happen. Rowan had curled up beside her, resting his head against her knee, when his small body suddenly tensed. Mira felt the shift immediately, her instincts sharpened by years of reading the subtle signs of distress in wounded creatures. But this tension felt different from fear. It felt like something building, something straining against its own boundaries. "Rowan?" she asked softly, watching him carefully. "Are you well?" The cub did not answer, could not answer, but his body continued to tremble, not with the fear she had grown so accustomed to reading, but with something else entirely, something that looked almost like effort, like struggle, like a creature pushing against walls that had held firm for so long they had begun to feel permanent. Mira rose quickly and moved to the door, calling for a guard to fetch the king immediately, sensing that whatever was happening deserved his presence, deserved to be witnessed by the father who had waited so patiently for this exact moment. By the time Varric arrived, breathless from having run the length of the castle, Rowan's small form had begun to shimmer at the edges, a strange, shifting light playing across his fur that neither of them had seen before. "What is happening?" Varric asked, his voice tight with a mixture of hope and fear. "I believe," Mira said carefully, hardly daring to voice the hope building in her own chest, "that he is trying to shift." They watched together, breath held, as the shimmering light around Rowan's small body intensified, his form beginning to stretch and change in ways that seemed to cause him visible strain. A whimper escaped him, sharp with effort and perhaps a flicker of the old fear returning, uncertain whether this change would bring safety or the terror he had fled from so many months ago. "You can do this," Mira said softly, kneeling beside him again, though she did not reach out to touch him, understanding instinctively that this particular struggle was one he needed to face largely on his own, even as he needed to know they were there, watching, ready to catch him if he faltered. "You are safe. Whatever happens, you are safe." Varric knelt on his son's other side, his large hand hovering close but not quite touching, offering the same steady presence without interference. "We are both here," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We are not going anywhere." The shift did not complete smoothly. Rowan's small form stretched, then seemed to catch, then retreated back into wolf form entirely, a whimper of frustration and exhaustion escaping him as the effort proved too much to sustain. He collapsed against the floor, panting, clearly having exhausted himself in the attempt. But it had happened. For the first time in 5 months, Prince Rowan had attempted to shift back into his human form. "It is all right," Mira said gently, gathering him carefully into her arms, as his small body trembled with exhaustion. "You do not need to force it. It will come, when your body and your heart are both ready together." This was already such a brave and important step. Varric reached out and gently stroked his son's fur, his own eyes wet with tears that had become far more familiar to him over these past months than he ever would have expected from a king raised to value stoic composure above all else. "You were so brave," he echoed softly. "We are so proud of you." That night, after Rowan had finally settled into an exhausted, peaceful sleep, Varric and Mira sat together in the quiet hallway outside his chamber, both still processing the significance of what they had witnessed. "He is close," Mira said, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "Closer than I expected him to be at this stage. Whatever fear held him in that form for so long, it is weakening. I believe fully now that he will find his way back to himself, and I believe it may happen sooner than either of us anticipated." "I do not know how to thank you," Varric said, turning to look at her fully, the moonlight catching the emotion still evident in his tired eyes. "You have given me back pieces of my son that I feared were lost forever." "You do not need to thank me," Mira said, as she always did, though something in her tone had softened over these past months, losing some of its earlier formal distance. "Watching him heal has been its own reward, more than you could possibly understand." Varric reached out then, hesitantly, and took her hand in his, a gesture that carried far more weight than words alone could have conveyed. Mira did not pull away. Instead, she laced her fingers gently through his, and they sat together in the quiet hallway, united not only by their shared devotion to a healing child, but by something else entirely, something that had been growing quietly between them, across these long, difficult, ultimately hopeful months. "Whatever happens next," Varric said softly, "I am grateful beyond measure that fate brought you to this castle." "As am I," Mira replied, and meant every word of it completely. Neither of them could have known, in that peaceful, hopeful moment, that the greatest test of everything they had built together still lay ahead of them, waiting in the shadows beyond the castle walls, where old enemies had not forgotten the wounded prince they had once tried to destroy. Word reached the castle 3 days later, carried by a breathless messenger who had ridden through the night from the eastern border. Callum brought the news directly to the king's study, his usually composed expression tight with concern. "Your Grace," he said, "our scouts have confirmed movement along the eastern ridge, riders bearing no banner, moving with purpose toward the capital. Our informants believe they are remnants of the same faction, responsible for the attack on the Queen and the Prince." Varric's hands curled into fists on his desk, old fury rising alongside fresh fear. How many? Perhaps 20, small enough to move quietly, large enough to cause significant harm, if they reach the castle grounds unchallenged. "They believe him weak," Varric said quietly, understanding immediately what this renewed aggression meant. "They believe that because my son has not shifted back, because he remains vulnerable in his smaller form, this is the moment to finish what they started 5 months ago. That is our assessment as well, Your Grace." Varric rose from his desk, his expression hardening into the commanding presence his court had not seen in months, the grieving father temporarily giving way to the warrior king, who had defended his kingdom's borders many times before. "Double the guard around the prince's chamber immediately. I want archers stationed at every approach to that wing of the castle, and find Mira. She needs to know what is happening." Mira received the news with a calm that surprised even herself, though beneath that calm, fear coiled tightly in her chest. Fear not for herself, but for the small, healing creature she had come to love, as fiercely as if he were her own. "I will not leave him," she said immediately, when Varric explained the situation to her in his study that evening, the two of them alone, with the weight of the threat hanging heavy between them. "Whatever happens, I will not leave his side. Mira, this is dangerous. These are the same people who murdered my wife. If they reach the castle, then I will be there to protect him, just as she was," Mira said firmly, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I did not spend 5 months helping that child find his way back to safety, only to abandon him the moment real danger returns. I understand the risk, Varric. I am choosing to stay regardless." It was the first time she had called him by his name alone, without title, and something in the simple intimacy of it steadied them both against the fear pressing in from every side. Over the following 2 days, the castle transformed into something closer to a fortress under siege. Guards patrolled every hallway. Archers took their positions along the outer walls. Varric personally inspected every entrance to the wing where his son's chamber remained, refusing to trust the safety of his family to anyone else's judgment alone. Rowan sensed the shift in atmosphere immediately, his earlier progress toward calm and trust beginning to fray at the edges as the tension around him mounted. He grew skittish again, flinching at unexpected sounds, retreating slightly from the closeness he had only recently begun to allow. "He can feel it," Mira told Varric on the second night, as they stood together outside the chamber, both exhausted from the strain of preparation and worry. Animals sense danger long before it arrives. His body remembers what happened the last time this particular kind of tension filled the castle. "I will not let it happen again," Varric said, his voice carrying an edge of steel that Mira had not heard from him before. The voice of a king prepared to do whatever necessary to protect what remained of his family. "Whatever comes through that door, they will have to go through me first." The attack came on the third night, under cover of heavy cloud that blotted out the moon and stars alike, the kind of darkness that favored those who wished to move unseen. The first alarm sounded from the eastern wall, where 3 riders had been spotted attempting to scale the outer defenses. Guards responded immediately, and the sound of the confrontation echoed distantly through the castle. Muffled shouts and the clash of steel against steel carried on the night wind. Varric was already moving before the second alarm sounded, sword in hand, his instincts as a warrior taking over completely. "Stay with him," he ordered Mira, who had already positioned herself firmly between the chamber door and whatever might come through it. "Do not open this door for anyone but me." "Go," Mira said, her own voice steady, despite the fear coursing through her. "We will be here." Inside the chamber, Rowan had already sensed the danger, his small body pressed tightly against Mira's side, trembling not with the confused terror of nightmares, but with the sharp, immediate fear of a creature who understood, on some instinctive level, that real danger approached. "I am here," Mira whispered to him, gathering him close, her own heart pounding, as the sounds of conflict grew louder somewhere beyond the chamber walls. "I am not leaving you. No matter what happens, I am not leaving you." The fighting seemed to last an eternity, though in truth it concluded within the hour, Varric's guards proving more than capable of repelling the small, poorly coordinated assault. 3 attackers were captured alive, providing valuable information about the faction responsible, while the rest fled back into the darkness from which they had come, their mission an unmistakable failure. When Varric finally returned to the chamber, sword still in hand, his face and clothes marked by the strain of battle but otherwise unharmed, he found Mira exactly where he had left her, still curled protectively around his trembling son, both of them safe, both of them waiting. "It is over," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion and relief. "They are dealt with. You are both safe." Mira looked up at him, tears of relief slipping freely down her face, now that the danger had passed. The fear she had held so carefully controlled, finally allowed to surface. "We held," she said simply. "We stayed together, and we held." Varric crossed the room and knelt beside them both, gathering his son gently into one arm, while reaching for Mira's hand with the other. The 3 of them huddled together in the aftermath of danger, successfully weathered, united in a way that no threat, past or future, would ever be able to fully break apart again. Rowan, sensing perhaps that the danger had truly passed, let out a small, tired whimper, and pressed himself against his father's chest, seeking comfort that Varric was, for the first time in 5 months, fully able to provide without hesitation or fear of rejection. "We are safe," Varric murmured against his son's fur, his other hand still tightly clasping Mira's. "All of us. We are safe now." And for the first time since that terrible night 5 months earlier, the small family, broken so completely by tragedy, and now slowly, carefully rebuilt, through patience and unwavering devotion, believed those words completely. Spring arrived slowly over the following weeks, the harsh grip of winter finally loosening its hold on the mountains surrounding the castle, and with it came a change that the entire kingdom had waited 5 long months to witness. It happened on an ordinary morning, without the drama or struggle of the earlier attempt. Mira had arrived at her usual hour, to find Rowan sitting calmly near the window, watching the first golden light of dawn spread across the distant hills. He turned to greet her as he always did now, but something about his posture seemed different, steadier, as though some final piece of tension had quietly released overnight while he slept. "Good morning," Mira said softly, settling onto the floor beside him, as had become their comfortable routine. The cub tilted his head at her, and then, without any of the visible strain that had accompanied his earlier attempt, the shimmering light began to gather around his small form once more. This time, there was no whimper of effort, no collapse of exhaustion partway through. The light simply grew, steady and warm, until it faded away entirely, and in place of the small gray cub sat a boy of 5 years, thin from months of limited eating, his dark hair tousled, his amber eyes, so familiar even in this new form, blinking up at her with something between wonder and uncertainty. "Mira?" he said, his voice small and rough from disuse, the first word he had spoken in 5 months. Mira's breath caught completely in her throat, tears springing immediately to her eyes as she reached for him, and this time he came willingly, climbing into her arms without hesitation, small human arms wrapping around her neck with a fierce, desperate need for comfort that transcended any form he might take. "You did it," she whispered against his hair, rocking him gently, overwhelmed by 5 months of hope finally, completely fulfilled. "Oh, Rowan, you did it." "I remember," he said quietly, his voice muffled against her shoulder, small and frightened, but present, fully present, in a way he had not been in months. "I remember everything. Mother, the window. I was so scared." "I know," Mira said softly, holding him close. "I know, my brave boy. You do not have to be scared anymore. You are safe. You have been safe for a long time now, even before you remembered how to tell yourself that." A guard, who had been standing watch at the door as always, froze in astonishment at the sight, before rushing immediately to fetch the king, understanding instinctively the magnitude of what had finally occurred. Varric arrived within minutes, having abandoned a council meeting, mid-sentence, the moment word reached him, running through the castle halls with a speed that scandalized several elderly advisors who had never seen their composed king move with such undignified urgency. He stopped in the doorway, and for a long moment simply stared, unable to fully process the sight before him. His son, his actual son, in human form, sitting in Mira's lap, small and thin, and achingly familiar, looking back at him with wide, uncertain eyes. "Father?" Rowan said, the word tentative, testing, as though he was not entirely certain of his welcome even now. Varric crossed the room in 3 long strides and dropped to his knees, gathering his son into his arms with a force that might have seemed too tight, if not for the desperate need behind it. 5 months of held-back grief and longing, finally releasing completely. "I am here," Varric said, his voice breaking completely, all pretense of royal composure abandoned entirely in this moment. "I am here, and I am never letting you out of my sight again. Do you understand me? Never again." Rowan clung to his father tightly, small fingers gripping the fabric of his shirt, and for a long while, neither of them spoke, simply holding each other, making up in silent embrace for 5 months of separation that had felt, at times, as though it might never end. Mira watched them together, her own tears flowing freely, feeling a fullness in her chest that she had not experienced in years, not since before her mother's death had left her searching quietly for purpose, in a world that had once felt unbearably cold. Later that day, once Rowan had eaten a proper meal at an actual table, dressed in clothes that fit his human form, rather than the blankets he had huddled in for so many months, and had been examined thoroughly by relieved castle healers who declared him remarkably healthy given his ordeal, Varric found Mira alone in the garden, watching the late afternoon sun paint the sky in soft shades of gold. "I do not know how to properly thank you," he said, coming to stand beside her. "You gave me back my son. There are no words sufficient for that gift." "You do not need words," Mira said, turning to face him with a warm smile. "Watching him remember how to laugh again has been thanks enough." Varric reached for her hand, and this time, there was no hesitation in the gesture, no uncertainty about what it meant between them. "I have come to care for you deeply, these past months," he said quietly. "Not only for what you have done for Rowan, though that alone would be enough to earn my eternal gratitude, but for who you are. Your patience, your quiet strength, the way you understand grief without ever trying to fix it too quickly, the way you simply sit beside it until it softens on its own. Mira felt her heart swell at his words, at the vulnerability behind them, so different from the guarded king who had first summoned her to his study 5 months earlier. "I have come to care for you too," she admitted softly. "For both of you. I did not expect, when I arrived here, that I would find a family in this castle. But I have, and I do not wish to leave it now that I have found it." "Then do not leave," Varric said simply, hope evident in every line of his face. "Stay with us, not as a healer summoned for a single task, but as part of this family, for as long as you are willing to remain." Before Mira could answer, a small voice called out from across the garden, and they both turned to see Rowan running toward them, unsteady still on legs that had not carried him in human form for many months, but running nonetheless, his face bright with a joy that neither of them had dared hope to see so soon. "Father! Mira! Look! I can run again!" He reached them breathless and laughing, and Mira knelt to catch him as he threw himself into her arms once more, while Varric wrapped his arms around them both, the three of them together in the golden evening light, a family rebuilt from the ashes of tragedy, through nothing more extraordinary than patience, love, and the simple, powerful choice to never give up on a wounded heart. The kingdom would come to know, in the years that followed, of the quiet healer who had walked into their castle during its darkest hour, and had never once demanded anything in return for the extraordinary gift she offered. They would know her as their queen eventually, when Varric and Mira wed the following spring, in a ceremony attended by every corner of the realm. But to Rowan, growing steadily stronger and more joyful with each passing season, she would always simply be the woman who had sat quietly beside him when the whole world felt too frightening to face alone, and who had never once let him go.